word of the year, right? You're muted. You're on mute. Hi, everyone. Thank you so
I thought it was me only.
No, it's me talking, not realizing I'm on mute. Thank you all so much for joining us for our June seminar. We are the Freed Peoples. Our mission is to actively build political power for communities of color through education, advocacy, and lobbying. We are a grassroots of individuals. We are teachers, we are parents, we are mothers, we are business owners. And I won't hold your time anymore. Delal, if you would like to take the stage, it's all yours.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this fine Saturday. My name is Delal, and I am the Strategic Outreach Lead Coordinator for the Freed Peoples. And I'm so glad that we are here today, and every month we are bringing you people from across the country to discuss important topics. This month, as you all know, June is month of, it's Pride Month, as well as Black Music Appreciation Month. And I've got a great lineup of people. Hi, Joe. Joseph Pearson is one of my absolute favorite people. He's a gem of a person. So he'll be speaking to us, as well as we've got Kenrick Ross and Damon Batiste, which I'll introduce later. So I've got Joseph Pearson here, who's a healthcare consultant focusing on value-based care and patient-centered analytics with over 15 years of experience. And he will be discussing key policy. His seminar will be focusing on key policy. What is the status of civil rights overall in 2021, coming after 4 years of the Trump administration? Key priorities, key civil rights issues, and what are the changes we'll see under Biden administration. And then he will address where healthcare overlaps with anti-racism and people of color. With that said, the floor is yours, Joe. Welcome, and please go ahead.
Awesome, Delal. Thank you so much. Really happy to be here. Want to wish everyone, happy Saturday afternoon. And let me share my screen.
Oh, there you go.
Yep, there we go. Focusing on value-based care. But previous to this work, I had worked in social justice advocacy with an emphasis on anti-racism, intergroup dialogue, and I had worked with Amnesty International before that. So really interested to be able to speak to the state of LGBT civil rights and issues accordingly, but also as that relates to my work day-to-day in healthcare. All right, are we able to see the shared screen okay, Delal? Thumbs up?
Yep.
So this is a unique time right now in Washington, D.C. With the new administration, there's no shortage of crises that the administration is focusing on, including a number of opportunities and unmet needs related to LGBTQ policies. The Trump administration had spent the majority of its 4 years in office launching a barrage of attacks, infringing on the rights of LGBTQ people, promoting what is often addressed and referred to as discriminatory policies, and creating barriers to access critical government services for members of our community. These actions reflect the Trump administration's disregard for a lot of the rights and well-beings of LGBTQ people, their families, and communities, and in particular, the damages that were caused by the administration exacerbated existing inequalities and disparities between LGBTQ and non-LGBTQ people in the realms of health, employment, the criminal justice system, law enforcement, education, housing, and immigration. The real-world consequences of these policies have been detrimental to the lives of a lot of queer people, especially LGBTQ people of color, living at the intersection of identities that experience multiple forms of systemic and institutional discrimination. priorities that we're expecting the Biden administration to make significant progress in include addressing protections for non-discrimination in government services, benefits, and programs, issuing executive actions to restore and protect religious liberty, and not couching religious liberty rights as a cover or Trojan horse for discrimination against LGBT people, reversing the transgender military service ban to ensure non-discrimination for people with HIV in the military as well, creating a federal plan to address increasing violence against transgender people, especially Black transgender women. And this is really key, making data collection a top priority, as that is often lacking and was severely omitted in the Trump years. I want to focus specifically on federal LGBTQ policies and healthcare. LGBTQ people face unique challenges, inequities, and disparities, both in terms of their physical and mental health, but also in their ability to access health insurance and healthcare. The physical and mental health of the LGBTQ communities is drastically affected by forces such as adverse and lived experiences of discrimination, stigma, violence, and other social, political, and economic determinants of health. In particular, compared to heterosexual and cisgendered people, research demonstrates that certain populations of the LGBTQ community are more vulnerable to suffering from chronic health conditions. We have seen higher prevalence and earlier onset of disabilities, recorded higher rates of illness and health challenges related to HIV/AIDS, substance use disorder, mental health, and sexual and physical violence. And also due to racism and social determinants of health, LGBTQ people of color, particularly transgender people of color, face especially significant health disparities and obstacles to accessing insurance and getting quality healthcare. I think what we want to focus on in the 4 years of Joe Biden's administration are really these core areas policy-wise. A lot of the LGBT national advocacy organizations have focused on these priorities, which are creating overarching multi-agency priorities to improve the well-being of LGBTQ people, really ensuring that there's cohesion among disparate government agencies. Also increasing access to affordable, high quality, and non-discriminatory healthcare services and insurance benefits, promoting the economic security and financial stability of LGBTQ people by fostering inclusive labor practices and workplace policies, protecting and strengthening LGBTQ civil rights and within the criminal justice system and law enforcement in particular, fostering inclusive, safe, welcoming, and affirming schools, ensuring that there is access to safe and stable housing for LGBTQ people, as well as support services for those who are unhoused, and then supporting fair and humane treatment of LGBTQ immigrants, including the promotion of rights of LGBTQ people abroad. Some additional policies that are likely a big focus right now, and we can see some progress on, are issuing executive actions to ensure non-discrimination in government services across the board, and these other issues right here. So we're really excited, especially with the emphasis on data and recording LGBT populations into population health analytics. I think it's worth noting that this particular week is noteworthy, since in Los Angeles 40 years ago, this week was the first ever reference to HIV/AIDS, what would later be identified as the AIDS epidemic. And in fact, on July 3rd of 1981 was the first New York Times article on a rare cancer seen in 41 homosexuals by Lawrence Altman. And this is really also a milestone of 40 years of sustained activism from queer activists, including ACT UP. LGBT policy has always been intimately linked to healthcare policy. It's been a huge part of the identity of the civil rights movement. And this is, again, a huge milestone. It's also worth noting that our historical reference points for activism have tended to favor and skewed towards overrepresenting the role of cisgendered white gay men in the LGBTQ community. And That's an enduring critique, and definitely something that a lot of current civil rights are looking more at intersectionality and ensuring there's anti-racism and other considerations that are built into future LGBT policies for inclusion. And indeed, just as a note here, this is also the 52nd anniversary of the Stonewall Riots, which was a series of protests that was started by a Black transgender woman named Marsha P. Johnson. These 1969 riots are credited with sparking the contemporary LGBTQ rights movement. However, in the 52 years since, not everyone has benefited equally. Much of the LGBT civil rights movement was dominated by and chiefly served to benefit white cisgendered men. And prominent LGBTQ organizations were run by and served the core constituencies of white members of the community. Something that I want to focus on in particular is a note on the Affordable Care Act. The Trump administration itself significantly focused on attacking the ACA and jeopardizing access to insurance coverage, health benefits, and non-discriminatory protections of the LGBT community to a devastating effect. Not only did the administration repeatedly try to undermine the law's consumer protections, including non-discrimination safeguards for LGBTQ people and protecting pre-existing conditions, but it also made it easier for health insurance companies and providers to deny care and services by providing faith-based providers a license to discriminate against LGBTQ people and people seeking reproductive health care. So as we continue to grapple with public health and economic consequences of COVID-19, the attempts to demolish the ACA and other critical healthcare policies are really detrimental to LGBTQ people, people with disabilities, and people with pre-existing conditions, as well as communities of color, all of whom had made significant gains under the law's passage. There was a fantastic book by Jonathan Cohen on the 10-year war, documenting the struggles of ACA implementation and ensuring its safeguard. All right. This is a menu of the top legislative and executive order priorities that we'll likely see in the in the Biden administration, building off the Obama administration, that are related to healthcare. I'm going to start right here with an acknowledgement on rescinding and replacing rules and regulations from Section 1557 of the ACA. So again, the Trump administration had really made this a huge focus, which 1557 of the ACA was the law's primary civil rights provision that weakened critical protections issued by a 2016 Obama-era rule. And among other harms, the final rule attempts to specific non-discrimination protections based on sexual orientation, gender identity, sex stereotyping, and eliminates safeguards on transgender-specific exclusions in health insurance. So this has been a big focus of the Biden administration. Another big focus is rescinding rules and regulations permitting overly broad religious and moral exemptions from providing contraception. The Trump administration had issued rules and regulations facilitating religious and moral exemptions and accommodations for the coverage of certain prevention services under the ACA. And these rules exempted and accommodated any employer with religious objections and nearly all employers with moral objections to the ACA requirement that employers provide contraception coverage. Another large priority among LGBT advocacy organizations is disbanding the Conscience and Religious Freedom Division and rescind the denial of care rule. This was the result of a 2019 ruling. The Conscience and Religious Freedom Division within the OCR, Health and Human Services, issued a final denial of care rule. By expanding OCR's enforcement authority of healthcare conscience laws, this rule permits providers and health insurance and a whole bunch of other people in healthcare to opt out of providing care that they claim violates their moral or religious beliefs and can disproportionately be used to discriminate against LGBT people. There's also a priority to rescind discriminatory health and human services grant regulations. The Trump administration's final rule on HHS grants explicitly strips beneficiaries from receiving federally funded services. The policy signals a tolerance of discrimination by forcing LGBTQ people to depend on unreliable and non-LGBTQ inclusive patchwork of program-based non-discriminationary provisions. All right, the next one here is there is a focus on rescinding the Title 10 domestic gag rule, which is the only domestic federal program exclusively specializing in providing people with reproductive health and family planning services, such as free and low-cost birth control, contraception, STI infections, breast and cervical cancer screenings, HIV testing, and other kinds of preventative health care. While saving taxpayer money across the country, nearly 4,000 Title X funded family planning and reproductive health centers annually serve about 4 million low-income and underinsured clients. It plays a really crucial role in addressing health disparities and providing care to LGBTQ people, women of color, and immigrant women. Another priority among advocates is restoring and enhancing critical LGBTQ data collection. So the adoption and foster care analysis and reporting system collects case level information on all children in foster care and those who've been adopted. The data is critical for determining awards, allocating funds, and engaging in strategic planning, determining technical assistance, conducting reviews, and the Trump administration issued a rule that eliminates data collection on sexual orientation for youth, which we would like to advocate to be added back in. There's also a call to issue an executive order on national HIV/AIDS strategy, as this has not been a priority under the Trump administration. There's a call to eliminate transgender exclusions in healthcare. The Trump administration's final rule on Section 1557 eliminated a critical provision of the 2016 Obama-era rule that prevented discrimination based on gender identity and eliminated transgender-specific exclusions. There's a priority to issue rules designating LGBTQ people as a medically underserved population. And due to the prevalence of discrimination, barriers to accessing healthcare, and significant health disparities experienced by LGBTQ people, there's a strong push that HRSA engage in notice and comment rulemaking to designate the LGBTQ population as a medically underserved population. Because of the shortage of healthcare providers with adequate training to provide care in a culturally affirming, non-discriminatory, and culturally competent fashion, it's also recommended that this gets fast-tracked as a top priority in the next year. And this adoption of categorizations would complement the status of LGBTQ populations as an NIH-designated health disparity population. Another focus is strengthening standards relating to protecting immigrant youth in Health and Human Services custody from sexual violence. Isolated from their parents and caregivers, LGBTQ immigrant youth, many of whom are already facing high rates of violence and trauma in their countries of origin, are particularly vulnerable to sexual abuse and harassment while in federal detention facilities. Currently, before being released to their parents or sponsors, unaccompanied children are temporarily housed by Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR, in a network of facilities operated by contractors and grantees. And this has been full of problems, to say the least. The interim rules also contain overextending religious exemption, permitting grantees and contractors with religious objections to abstain from complying with components of the sexual assault prevention and response standards. So there's an appeal of the Biden administration to issue a final rule that adopts comments suggesting mechanisms to prevent this type of abuse. There's also a big focus on expanding mental health support services and training related to LGBTQ youth and adults. There's a myriad of factors that adversely affect the mental health of LGBTQ youth, including family rejection, stigmatization, discrimination, as well as intersectional stress from other identities. And a lot of schools are hostile environments for LGBTQ youth. Unfortunately, LGBTQ populations are unable to receive the health services they require due to a lack of training and cultural competency for this population. And another big priority is prohibiting medically unnecessary surgery on intersex children. Intersex is an umbrella term used to describe someone with internal or external sex characteristics or anatomy that does not fit the standard binary definitions of male or female. And currently, intersex children are regularly subjected to medically unnecessary or cosmetic surgeries. There's a big poll with an organization known as SAGE, who has a presence in New York, on protecting LGBTQ elders by fully implementing the 2020 Older Americans Act. A lot of LGBT elders have experienced stigma and discrimination through their lives and encounter unique challenges to healthy aging. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated a lot of these health and housing disparities among these elders who are at increased risks of the virus's harm and in need of access to culturally competent quality care. And there's an appeal to make a senior position at the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services to coordinate and foster policies promoting the health and rights of LGBTQ people. Within Health and Human Services, CMS maintains a broad range of responsibilities, but there is an appeal to establish a senior position that's specifically responsible for coordinating, overseeing, and enforcing policies that incorporate the health and rights of LGBTQ people across all of CMS. I think what we're likely to see in this first year is advancement of the following 5 proposed acts. We have the Equality Act, which is focused on discriminatory experiences that adversely affect impacts on the financial, mental, and physical well-being of LGBTQ people. And this would prohibit discrimination on the basis of social identities in the realm of employment, housing, public spaces, goods, services, credit access, jury, and federal funding. I think we can also expect to see advancement of the Do No Harm Act, which, just to summarize this quickly, which amends a previous ruling in 1993, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, to prohibit granting exemptions to critical civil rights laws that could meaningfully harm third-party people, which could disproportionately affect the LGBT community. There's a proposed LGBTQ Data Inclusion Act I'm really excited about. This would require government agencies to collect voluntary self-disclosed information on LGBTQ identities in all existing surveys that collect demographic data while preserving privacy and confidentiality. And the Dignity for Detained Immigrants Act features many important policies to better protect immigrants, such as provisions to establish presumption that vulnerable individuals, including LGBTQ people, should be placed in community-based supervision and programs. And the Safe School Improvement Act would be able to require school districts in states that receive funding under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 to adopt codes of conduct that prohibit bullying and harassment based on sexual orientation and gender identity. There have already been some great wins in the Biden administration. Visibility matters, as we've seen with the appointment of Dr. Rachel Levine, who formerly headed Pennsylvania's Health and Human Services Department at the state level, was confirmed as Assistant Secretary for Health and Human Services, the first openly transgender American in this role. And on the whole, the Biden administration's cabinet is a cabinet that looks and reflects the diversity and spectrum of American identities. I think in conclusion here, I just want to say the Biden-Harris campaigned with a promise to stand up for the rights of LGBTQ people, asserting that President Biden will stand with the LGBTQ community to ensure America finally lives up to the promise on which it was founded, equality for all. The last 4 years have represented a backslide in the federal policy advancing LGBTQ rights. And during this Pride Month, I think it's helpful to look back on how far we've come collectively, where we have to go, and to not take any of these rights for granted.
Wow, Joe, thank you so much. That was wonderful. I really appreciate you taking the time and doing this for us. I learned so much. And for time's sake, I'm going to introduce Kenrick real quick. And then hopefully we have Damon joining us as well right after Kenrick. And hopefully if we have time, we can do a quick Q&A. So if any of you have any questions, please include them in the chat box. So Kenrick, hi Kenrick, so nice.
Hey.
Ross, good, nice to have you. He spent the last 15 years in social impact leadership addressing inequity and inequality gaps, particularly in BIPOC communities. And he's currently the executive director of the National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Alliance. He also founded the lgbtq POC organization called Urban Ad Out, and is a huge advocate for inclusive sports and fitness. And Kenrick will be focusing on, his seminar will be specific to his organization in New York City on addressing issues for people of color. Kenrick, thank you for doing this. Thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Absolutely. Let me share my screen. Thank you for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Hi.
Okay. Let's see. So I'm going to pull this up. And can you all see my screen? Okay.
Not quite. So if you click share, hopefully.
Let's see. Window, Chrome.
Crossed. It'll work. Yes, there it is. All right.
All right. So I'm actually going to share a mix of the policy platforms, both for New York City and for Incapia's work across the country on LGBTQ equity and equality issues, and kinds of the things that we, in coalition as a national organization with other LGBTQ organizations, that we would hopefully see some progress being made during the next 4 years, most likely within the next 2 years of the Biden administration. So I think as we're at the point right now where thankfully there are not many things that are specifically LGBTQ policies that are not part of a larger effort. So, you know, there are many intersections to a lot of the policies that we are pursuing, and they're couched that in addressing these as LGBTQ policy issues, you are also raising the floor for every American, particularly other groups that are multiply marginalized. So there are very few places remaining, except for things like transgender troops being banned from military, or LGBTQ people, particularly gay men, being restricted from giving blood. Much of what is now the LGBTQ civil rights platform is interwoven with lifting and uplifting the rights of a larger number of communities, which we consider to be a good thing. And so I'll start with Joe touched a little bit on the Equality Act. And I want to address a few things about the Equality Act to start with, including the fact that when we advocate on the Equality Act, we're often asked, while in 2020 in Bostock versus Clayton County, didn't you accomplish what you needed to accomplish? And that is, yes. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was expanded to include SOGI, sexual orientation and gender identity, but employment. So the Biden administration, unlike the Trump administration, has extended that interpretation of the Supreme Court ruling to other federal agencies and to other areas of American life, healthcare and education and things like that. But that is the administration's prerogative. Two, there are many aspects of the existing suite of civil rights legislation that needs to be updated, not just to benefit and to make LGBTQ people more equal, but to update everything that has come in the last 50 years. And we often say that we think of civil rights as a journey, and it's an ever expanding pathway. So for example, today is the anniversary of Loving versus Virginia, 54 years ago, the Supreme Court, only 54 years ago, the Supreme Court decided that interracial marriage was legal. So we're talking about updating laws from 50, 60 years ago to expand them to include more Americans and to include more spaces where discrimination happens. So a few things about the Equality Act. It is not necessarily landmark legislation. It is legislation that asks us to expand protections to include LGBTQ Americans and to expand the ways those protections work to modernize how we look at civil rights. So it will amend existing civil rights laws to explicitly include sexual orientation and gender identity. It will amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to prohibit discrimination in public spaces and services and federally funded programs on the basis of sex. So that is not just LGBTQ, that's also gender, expansion of gender equity. And will expand public spaces and services to include retail stores and services as banks and legal services and transportation services, which will benefit everybody, not just LGBTQ people. So when you think of the Equality Act, one, think of it as updating the suite of civil rights protections that we have to make them fairer and more expansive and to come in line with society today, not what was seen and what was visible in 1964. A big issue we hope the Biden administration moves on, particularly for LGBTQ people, is immigration reform. So these are two-pocket comparison of undocumented and documented LGBTQ immigrants. There are a significant percentage of LGBTQ immigrants in the United States, adults, are undocumented. About 23% are undocumented. They are overwhelmingly people of color. At least 80% are people of color. They are also younger and more male identifying than both undocumented immigrants as a general population and also the LGBTQ population as a whole. The reason why we do advance policies, of course, for documented immigrants, making sure that family-based immigration continues to happen, making sure that there are laws in place and there are reforms that will happen that will make it easier, for example, to adopt, to bring family over, those kinds of things. But ultimately, the most vulnerable LGBTQ immigrants are those who are undocumented. So we are hoping that the administration lives up to its promises to undertake comprehensive immigration reform. And it's not just immigration reform that we are focused on. We are focusing on a pathway to citizenship, which is very, very important for undocumented LGBTQ folks who are in the United States right now, including Dreamers, who are also disproportionately LGBTQ, but also to, one, address the deportation and detention of undocumented LGBTQ people in the United States. So at the very least, do no harm, which has been incredibly harmful during the Trump administration, particularly deporting LGBTQ adults to countries that they have almost never lived in, and they are at incredible vulnerability because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. That happened across the last 4 years. The Biden administration has promised to roll back and to do targeted deportations. That remains to be seen, but we are very much focused on making sure the administration understands that deporting LGBTQ people puts them in positions where they are at risk of being killed. And the third piece of this is asylum and refugee status. So during the Trump administration, as you know, there's something called the Muslim ban. That also prevented many LGBTQ folks from those countries that would seek asylum in the United States or had won visa lotteries to come to the United States, those are almost life-saving visas. So that was 4 years they were on ICE. We're asking the Biden administration to not just raise the cap on refugees and make it make it easier for LGBTQ people to apply and be successful, but also for those people who were frozen out of the United States for the last 4 years to provide some level of redress. The pandemic impacts of particularly economics and employment has been much worse for LGBTQ people than they have been for American society in general. Here's a few statistics. I'm not going to go into that too much, but suffice to say, LGBTQ people of color, LGBTQ immigrant communities have borne disproportionate brunt of the economic hardship of the pandemic, and no other group more than Black folks of trans experience. Another issue that doesn't get a lot of traction that we are advocating for is HIV decriminalization. Yes, cases are still being pursued in the United States that criminalize people with HIV. 32 states still have specific laws or harsher penalties for those living with HIV. And at least a dozen states routinely try to put this into practice. So we are hopeful that this is a state level legislative policy, but this is something that as science and good sense catches up with policy, that more and more of these laws are either removed either they're definitely removed and then we move towards a process of expunsion. The final thing I'll touch on is the rise of anti-trans bills across the country, which has focused, this is a map of the parts of the country. As you get redder, you see where more and more anti-trans bills, at least 36, have been introduced since Joe Biden has become president. And most of these bills have focused on sports. So the culture war against trans folks have shifted from bathrooms to locker rooms, and it's shifted from adults to children. It is not blunt or hyperbole to say that conservatives expect this election in 2022 to be fought on the bodies of trans children. This is what they're pushing for. So a lot of these bills are Trojan horses in some ways that take data and conflate it and try to make what is seen to be a reasonable point. Ultimately, it's an attack on all trans people to be who they are in spaces that they should belong in. And I think that is it. I did want to touch on, I don't know where the New York City slide is. There should be a New York City slide, but 3 things I didn't want to touch on New York City. The first is some traction that has been made with legislation recently expanding LGBTQ rights, and that is the repeal of what is called the walking while trans ban. Earlier this year, this law that had been in place since 1976, it basically criminalized the presence of trans people under the guise of anti-loitering and under the guise of ending prostitution, was repealed in New York State. The next part of that is expungement of records. So we have moved from getting rid of this onerous law to making sure that there is some sort of recompense for those people, thousands of people who were charged under them to move forward. The second piece that we are working on in New York City is decriminalization of sex work. Sex work is criminalized across the country, except for 10 counties in Nevada, in all 50 states. There have been movements towards legalization. Legalization is not the same as decriminalization. The goal in New York State, and I mentioned this in New York State and New York City, is that we believe we are the closest anywhere in the country to actually decriminalize sex work in the next 2 years. We have already seen movement by prosecutors not to prosecute sex work charges. That's a good first step, but that is usually limited to when police officers have already harassed and made arrests of sex workers. What remains is the fact that thousands of people have this on their record, and also other aspects of sex work under the guise of preventing sex trafficking remain on the books. The promotion of sex work, for example, the buying of sex work, these remain crimes that are being prosecuted by the hundreds in New York City every year. And I mention that because we do believe we are close to doing this, and it will lead the rest of the country. And the third part is, in New York City, is the lack of shelter for youth in particular, but also for LGBTQ seniors. We've seen both of these populations during the pandemic, especially, experiencing intense levels of housing insecurity based on the fact that for youth, there are just not enough culturally competent shelters available. And for seniors, this is only now becoming an issue. So Joe mentioned SAGE, which does fantastic work, not just in New York City, but across the country. They have pioneered this. But ultimately, in New York City, with a new mayor, with a new city council, we're calling for massive improvements in housing in general, in shelter services in general, but literally hundreds and hundreds of more beds for youth. It seems like a short-term solution to a much larger problem. But when you're dealing with, on average, LGBTQ becomes unhoused at 14 years old in New York City. And 40% of homeless youth in New York City are LGBTQ. So it is a crisis literally on a nightly basis. And then we're looking, New York City has started to build several senior housing projects. So that we hope will be subsidized and expanded in the next administration. So I think that was a lot, but that's pretty much.
Wow, Kenrick, thank you so much. Those numbers are crazy. Thank you for doing this. Really appreciate your time. And again, for time's sake, I want to introduce our next speaker, Damon Batiste. If Rena can bring Damon on stage, that would be great. Damon is joining us from New Orleans, actually, and I'm very excited to have him. He's taking time out of his busy schedule to join us for this. Was just here. Oh, did he leave? Okay, hold on, Damon. Oh yeah, we're okay. Let me text him. I wonder what happened. Hi, we are ready for you. Yeah, he was just here a little bit ago, but I'm not sure what happened.
While Dalal is doing that, I'm over here just like,
yeah.
I had no idea that there was still, we know that there's stigma when it comes to HIV, but I had no idea there were laws. I had no idea about the children and the elderly. So, Kenrick, thank you so much. And Joe, thank you so much. The intersections of mental health and LGBTQ plus was enlightening, extremely enlightening. And so Dalal has left me on the stage by myself. All right, let's see. Here's Dalal. And we did have someone on the call earlier who is very interested in working with youth. And so I will make sure they get a copy of this. It looks like they're gone. They were here earlier, but I'll make sure they get a copy of that and is ready to work with our local youth.
Everybody.
The Trevor Project. Let me write that down, because unfortunately, this is going to be streamed to our YouTube or posted on our YouTube, but the chat doesn't go to YouTube. So in the chat, Kenrick is talking about the Trevor Project, and they said the Trevor Project just released a great report, LGBTQ youth during the pandemic. So we'll look up the Trevor Project and we'll put it on our Facebook and our Twitter so that you are fully educated on what Kenrick is speaking of. And then also in the chat, it wasn't able to come up. Joe said to become active, contact your members of Congress. This is a milestone moment. Read public support for LGBTQ rights. 70% of Americans, 70% of Americans support LGBTQ rights and same-sex marriage. But the key here is not to be complacent. So as you all know, we are unapologetic in what we do. And Joe said it's critical to emphasize the progress is not linear. And as you know, with politics, success is not guaranteed. Joe said, including 55% of Republicans. So why is it just sitting? What is going on? What's the holdup? 55% of Republicans also support this. First time there was a critical mass in that population. So very, very interesting.
Rena, I'm not sure what's happening, but maybe we can spend the rest of the time asking questions for Joe.
Okay.
And Nick. Unfortunately, I think we lost our last speaker. I'm assuming he's having technical issues, and he's out in, he's not joining from New Orleans. Actually, he's in LA. So he's attending a conference there. But anyways.
Well, maybe we have a video that we can put onto our Facebook of Damon. And that way everyone can see, unfortunately, what you missed this month. But do you want to tell us a little bit about Damon?
Yeah, Damon, he comes from a family of musicians. So my friend Will Sutton, he's a friend of mine, and I actually had him join us a few months ago on our network for an interview. So I reached out to him and asked him if he can recommend some, mover and shaker Black musicians, and he said, "Oh my God, the Batiste family in New Orleans! You have to, I'm going to put you in touch with Damon." So he comes from a family of musicians in New Orleans, and apparently they're like celebrities in New Orleans. So when you say the name Batiste, everybody knows who they are. So I was really excited to have him come and talk about, Black Music Appreciation Month and what it means for him, and talk about how he's impacting his community through his music and his art, but unfortunately, he won't be able to make it. So maybe another time we can have him.
Maybe another time. But we do have our June teach-in on June 26th. We will be live at the DAAC in Grand Rapids. We have 5 local activists, speakers coming to teach you. They'll be doing spoken word. We also have activists just coming to tell us about their experience in the LGBT community. We also have 3 live musical performances on June 26th, and that is streamable. But back to the chat, Kendrick said, every email and tweet to an elected official counts. Okay? Just call and say yes to the Equality Act. Let me write that down, the Equality Act. Okay, and so we will have something written up, posted on our Facebook, posted on our Twitter with our local numbers to our Michigan Senate that we can call and make sure that we are voting yes for the Equality Act. So we actually only have 5 minutes left, so we will cut it short. If you are viewing this not live, thank you again for streaming in and watching. If you are live, we do have coming up on your screen, there should be a link that says become a member. Becoming a member helps us to continue our educational portion of our mission. And on your screen should be a donate button. The donating, funding the Freed for the Future, helps our lobbying efforts. Everything that we're talking about today, we are getting into deeply with lobbying and advocating. You see us every Thursday at the Capitol here in Michigan advocating for BIPOC rights. So funding the Freed by donating helps us to continue advocating and lobbying for BIPOC communities. Once again, we want to say thank you for being here with us live, or thank you for streaming afterwards. Thank you to Joe and Kenrick for joining us. Thank you to Delal for hosting. As always, we will see you next month for our next pop-up, or on June 26th for our in-person teach-in. Bye.
Everybody.
Thank you.